going to take it from here.
See if there was a story there. And there certainly was a story of 4 centuries of desire and rivalry and empire. And I'm going to share some highlights of that story with you now. But first, we're going to take a look at something that is really at the basis of all of this. We're going to look at the color red itself, because to fully understand the impact that cochineal had on the world, we need to first understand the significance of that color in human history. Red is the color of blood, which may be why it grabs our attention. We respond to it physiologically. It makes our eyes dilate and our hearts beat faster. It's been sacred to humans for thousands of years. In Cro-Magnon times, people used red ochre for burial rites and cave paintings. And in countless other cultures since then, the color red has been the focus of powerful symbolism. Many societies have regarded it as a magical color. It may be said to cure sickness or to summon gods, to ward off witches. In most languages, the word for red is a very ancient word. It will be older than any other color term except for black and white. If there are 3 words for color in a language, it'll be black, white, and red. So that makes it older than the words for blue or green or purple or brown. It makes it really clear that red has appealed to humans for time out of mind, all the way back to the very beginnings of language. But it is one thing to admire a color and quite another to be able to reproduce it. Artists struggled for thousands of years to come up with a satisfactory red pigment, something that was brighter and more pleasing than the dull iron red ochre that you see in this cave painting. Eventually, painters discovered cinnabar, which has a number of names. It's often known as vermilion. It's mercury sulfide. As you can see from these frescoed walls in Pompeii, it produced a beautiful scarlet. Unfortunately, it had its downsides as well. It was expensive, it was unstable, but worst of all, it was poisonous. Nothing could beat it for color though, and so artists continued to use it for more than 1,000 years. Dyers, however, had a much tougher job. Their colors didn't just have to look good on a wall and to stay attached to it. Their colors had to stand up to sunlight, to sweat, and repeated washing. They had to be really durable. And neither ochre nor cinnabar was up to the job. And they didn't yield a bright red when they were applied to cloth either. So dyers had to look elsewhere. And over time, they learned to make russets, orange reds, fairly cheaply and easily from plants. But true red is a lot harder to make. It's a big challenge. And until artificial dyes were invented in the mid-19th century, the only way you could get a true red was to use exotic substances and secret techniques that most dyers would never master. It was a rare art. And because red cloth was so elusive and expensive, it becomes a prized possession. And in many cultures, it ends up being linked with high status. This 11th century Chinese painted silk, for example, shows a Song Dynasty emperor clad in rich red robes. And we'll see something like that too. This is a 16th century sultan. So you can see red is also finding its way into the wardrobes of rich Muslims. Red was also prized in Renaissance Europe, where it was the focus of powerful symbolism. Sometimes red was linked with hellfire and with sin, but it was also, and at the same time, a color closely associated with the divine. It's the color of Pentecostal fire, the blood of Christ, angels and martyrs. Even the Virgin Mary is often depicted in red. We think now of blue, but in medieval times, red was often the color that was used. Red was also a symbol of the Catholic Church, and some of the most beautiful red textiles in Europe were the silks worn by popes and especially by cardinals, as you can see in this painting by Raphael. And we can talk later if you want to ask me the questions just about the whole question of why it is that this cardinal red is associated with purple. Red and purple do go back, but red becomes the dominant color. Kings and princes are often wearing red cloth as well, in part because it's a sign of high status, but also because Europeans had long considered red the color of courage in war. So the idea that the ruler is someone who is victorious in war, is the leader of troops, is also just majestic, very high status. All of this is conveyed by the color red. It wasn't necessary to be a king to wear red in Renaissance Europe, but only wealthy people like this young woman could afford the finer varieties. If you were poor and of humbler rank, you might not be able to afford to wear much color at all. And you would have to settle, if you were looking for red, for a dull brick color or a pinkish color that would fade very quickly in the sun. And as certain groups of people begin to accumulate money, so there is the rise of lawyers, of merchants, more people are able to afford red cloth. And at that point, you start getting something called sumptuary laws that regulate what kind of clothing you can wear. Many cities and countries have them. And one of the things they do is regulate the color of the clothing by a person's rank in society. In most places, only the elite were allowed to wear scarlet and crimson, which are the most lasting, intense, and expensive shades of red. This young couple is wearing both colors. The man has a bright scarlet cap, and the woman is wearing a rich blue, red, crimson surcoat. And she has the veil as well that's richly embroidered, but red is the base color. Wealthy Europeans also would hang their walls with expensive red tapestries, and there was a thriving market in fine red carpets and draperies as well. So, in short, Renaissance Europeans were very hungry for rich red textiles, ones they could wear, ones they could live with. And elsewhere in the world, people also had a great appetite for the color. There was, however, a supply problem. As I alluded to earlier, only a handful of natural substances produce a rich red dye, and most of them are expensive, difficult to transport, and complicated to use. I'm going to talk to you about a few of those. Let's see, there we go. Here we go. Let me just go back to that here, because I do want to bring this up with you. This is the case I was talking about with merchants as they begin to wear these red colors. They often would do it in a somewhat limited fashion. They wouldn't wear, head to toe red. They would wear it as a sash or a scarf. And one of the most flamboyant ways to wear this was as a turban, as you see in this portrait by Jan van Eyck. And we look at it now and we say, what is that man doing in that red turban? But at the time, in the 15th century, when this was painted, people would have been able to read this and see it as a symbol of power and wealth and sophistication, in part because it was unusual as a turban, but also because it was red, and a really deep, intense red. So let me go ahead now and talk to you about the sources of red dye that were available somewhere around 1500. One of them is a red plant dye that's called madder. And you can see some splendid madder reds in this medieval tapestry, which is at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. They're also very common in Oriental rugs. But because madder contains more than a dozen coloring agents, it required great precision and a certain amount of luck in order to draw the right compounds from it. The reds tended toward orange, and even experienced dyers could end up with corals or russets, brick colors, or worst, a brown color instead of a good true red. For centuries, the best madder reds came from the Ottoman Empire and from points further east. They involved intricate processes that sometimes required more than a dozen steps. I've seen some that require nearly 30 steps. They can take up to 3 or 4 months to complete. So they're not for novices. And European dyers, even the ones who were very expert, had no success in imitating these techniques until the 18th century, so quite late. But even in the best hands, madder had some drawbacks. It tended to fade on silk, which is one of the most important and in-demand luxury fibers at the time. And compared with some of the other red dyes, it was not particularly luminous. Its surface was flat and even dull. And this is something to think about, that these days we tend to think about colors in terms of their hue more than anything else. But back at the time, and particularly when you were talking about clothing, people were thinking also about the intensity of a color and its luminosity and its sheen. And they were thinking about how it would appear at different times and under different lights, how it would appear in broad sunlight. We might think today about how something will appear under fluorescent light, but at the time they were thinking, how will this appear under candlelight? And, if you have a particularly dark red, it's probably just going to look like a brownish color if the light is very dull. So something that picked up the light, something that was luminous, something that had sheen, was all the more valuable for that reason. So dyers are looking for better reds and something that has more luminosity than madder. Some try a lichen called orchil. They also use dye woods like Brazil wood, but these tend to fade very quickly when they're exposed to light. There's also lac, which is used primarily in Asia. That's an insect dye, but it's sticky and the gummy resin could ruin cloth. So that was also something technically very difficult to handle. And the red it produces is also on the dark side. It's not going to give you brilliant shades again, unless you're really, really adept in the techniques. In both Europe and the Middle East, most dyers preferred something different called kermes. Another name for it was grain. This is what's related to the grana and cochineal. This term, kermes or grain, encompasses 3 different red dyes that were closely related. And they were widely regarded as the best and most valuable red dyes in Europe and much of Eurasia. And all of them come from insects. You could think of them as distant cousins to cochineal. The first one is called oak kermes, and it comes from an insect that lived on Mediterranean oak trees. The next was called St. John's blood, and that was on an insect on the roots of a grassy plant that would grow in Eastern Europe and parts of Russia and Asia Minor. It was incredibly difficult to harvest these insects. You had to pull up the grass and then you had to strip the insects off the roots, which tells you just how desperate people were for a beautiful red. The third of the 3 kermes dyestuffs was Armenian red, which is native to Asia Minor, and it's considered by many to be the best red of all, but it's probably harder to get hold of than any of the others. And each insect had a large amount of fat, which caused problems in the dyeing process. So to sum up, if you are living in Europe or the Middle East or Asia in about 1500, then these are the main red dyestuffs available to you: madder, orchil, Brazil wood, lac, and the 3 kinds of kermes. And practically speaking, you probably would only be able to get hold of these if you had a lot of money, and you'd only get a subset of those because at any given time, only a few might be available in your area. So in 1519, when Spanish conquistadors come across a new source of red dye in an Aztec marketplace, it was very big news. The conquistadors called the dye stuff grana cochineal. The Aztecs knew it, though, as nochestli, a word that meant blood of the nopal cactus. You can see a drawing of a nopal cactus covered with cochineal here. It comes from the archives of the Indies in Seville, the place where I was researching the chocolate trade. It's an idealized picture on many grounds, but certainly in the way that cochineal is placed. In real life, the cochineal would spread out unevenly on the cactus, and it would look like blotchy patches of cotton or lichen. What this drawing does show really well is the process of harvesting the cochineal. It was painstaking work. The cochineal was gently dislodged from the cactus, with small sticks or stiff brooms, and it was collected in baskets or wooden bowls. And then I'm going to give you a glimpse of the next stage in the process. After this, the cochineal is steamed in ovens or over the fire, as you can see in the background here. It could also be dried in the sun. When you're looking at this engraving, keep in mind that the cochineal is out of scale. It was drawn for a children's illustration in about 1800. So the cochineal is much larger than it would be in life, but it does give you an idea of the basic processes involved in getting the cochineal harvested and ready for market. Wild species of cochineal had thrived for thousands of years in many parts of the Americas, but the cochineal sold in Aztec markets was something else. It was a domesticated variety. It was developed and nurtured by humans. It was larger than its wild cousins, and it yielded a more powerful and more beautiful red dye. Now, the big question was, who domesticated this cochineal? Most scientists and historians believe that the people responsible were the ancient farmers of the southern Mexican highlands, near the area now known as Oaxaca, where this great city, Monte Alban, was located. So these are groups we now know as the Mixtecs, the Zapotecs. They were cultivating cochineal for hundreds and perhaps even thousands of years before the Spaniards arrived. And in the long run, and I think in a really beautiful way, we can see the cochineal turns out to be a lifesaver for their cultures and for their descendants. Cochineal is a very temperamental beast. It doesn't like to be too cold. It doesn't like to be too hot. It doesn't like to get too wet. It has a lot of natural predators. It's difficult to cultivate. And for most of the Spanish colonial period, indigenous Oaxacan farmers were the only people who knew how to raise it successfully. And this gives them a certain amount of leverage against the terrible pressures of the conquest. Many of the other indigenous communities in other parts of what we now think of as Mexico were forced to provide labor for Spanish mines and estates and other enterprises. And some of this was happening in Oaxaca as well. But in a more limited way. In other places, these laborers were working often very far from home. They often died and never made it back. And with so many adults missing from communities, it was very hard to keep language and culture alive, to keep passing it along. It led to the breakup and sometimes even the entire disappearance of villages and even larger cultures. In Oaxaca, the cochineal farmers are able to keep their families and communities together because they're the only ones who can make this really valuable stuff. And the Spaniards want it, they have to give them some concessions. And that concession is that they get to stay with their families, with their communities. And that helps them preserve their language and cultures for centuries. To this day, the state of Oaxaca, where the cochineal trade was centered, remains the most culturally and linguistically diverse state in Mexico. And I think that is a testament to the incredible power of this connection between these people and this insect. It's a very difficult thing to domesticate an insect, but they did manage to do it. It was done in a few other cases as well. Ancient Mesoamericans were good at domesticating insects, but this one has a really profound long-term impact. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself though, so let's go back to the days when the conquistadors had just arrived in Mexico, when they saw cochineal being used in all sorts of ways. Mexican artisans were using cochineal to paint illustrations and to make these codices, these fantastic paintings. They were using it to dye fabrics, and it seems likely they used it in their intricate featherwork as well. Cooks were using it as a food coloring, doctors were prescribing it as a medicine, and Mexican women used cochineal as a cosmetic. And because of its great beauty and utility, The Aztecs are collecting cochineal as tribute from their subjects, as much as 9 tons a year. And I did the math on this. That amounts to more than 1 billion insects. It's a lot of insects. This pictograph here from a codex records the tribute assessments of various towns, and each dot represents a certain quantity of cochineal that was demanded at what was called a talega. And there's arguments about exactly how much that was, but that's what is being assessed here. Each of these dots is colored with cochineal ink just to round the full circle. So what happens when this dye gets to Europe? Well, after the conquest, it does take a while for the trade to really start up. But by the early 1540s, Europe's dyers are finally able to have enough cochineal that they can test it on silk. This happens in Venice as the first place that we know this was done. They were hoping to make the kind of fine fabric that elite families habitually wore, the kind of fabric you see in this portrait. Dyers discovered that ounce for ounce, cochineal was far more potent than the red dyestuffs that they were traditionally using. Modern estimates suggest it was up to 30 times more powerful than Armenian red, which was the very best of the Burmese dyes that they'd had up to that point. Depending on the ingredients it was combined with, cochineal could produce a range of colors from dark crimson to soft rose reds, like the 16th century velvet. But what Europeans loved most were the bright flame reds that they could get. And in fact, they figure out how to produce truly bright scarlets with cochineal by combining it with tin. And it was so bright that no dyer had ever seen this like before. The name of the man who discovers this process is Cornelis Drebbel. He's born in Holland in 1572. He's famous for inventing the first working submarine, which ran in the Thames. He came to London to ply his trade. He was a general inventor and engineer. He was also an alchemist, and for that reason, he was denounced at times as a magician and a sorcerer. My guess is that it was Drebbel's interest in alchemy that led him to experiment with cochineal. Most alchemists were fascinated with red dyes because red was said to be the color of the philosopher's stone. And that was the substance that would lead to immortality and vast wealth. That might have been what Drebbel was hoping to get, but instead, by adding tin and and an acid to the cochineal dye, Drebbel gets a brilliant scarlet. And the new dye is known sometimes by his name as Drebbel Scarlet, but also as Bow dye. There are a few other names. Causes a sensation in fashionable Europe. The new color was described by contemporaries as full of fire with a brightness that dazzles the eye. And this is an example of what it looked like. It was soon found in everything from ball gowns and court regalia to tapestries and bed hangings. We know that blankets dyed with cochineal and tin became a staple in the North American fur trade. And there's reason to suspect that they were also used in the slave trade. A type of Drebbel scarlet also found its way into English army uniforms, though tracing exactly how and when that happened is surprisingly difficult. In the course of my research, I ran across many claims that all the British Redcoat uniforms were made with cochineal, but none of the writers could back that up with a good source. My own investigations indicate that the truth is more complicated. For many centuries, English troops fought in coats of many different colors, including at one point blue, but gradually red becomes the color of choice. And that's true of many societies going back to the Greeks and the Romans. And they were said to prefer red uniforms because they hid bloodstains, so it made their warriors look invincible. The first clear evidence we have that some kind of cochineal scarlet was being used in English army coats comes from 1649. Oliver Cromwell's government orders 16,000 red coats for English soldiers who were going to be stationed in Ireland. The supplier was from a region of England that was becoming famous for its woolens made with tin and cochineal, and it was this kind of cloth that Cromwell specifies in the order Cromwell's government specifies. As the British Army expanded over the course of the 18th century, the red coat became standard. But to the best of my knowledge, it wasn't always made with cochineal. Cheaper dyes, chiefly madder, appear to have been used for lower ranking soldiers, and the brighter and more intense and more expensive cochineal was used in officers' uniforms for men like John Burgoyne, for example, that we see here. And that leads us to something interesting, and it does have a revolutionary connection. There are historians who have suggested that cochineal may have played a strategic role in America's war for independence. The battles of Lexington and Concord, as the British were marching back toward Boston in a crucial early battle, colonial marksmen apparently could see differences in the red worn by the foot soldiers and the red worn by their officers, and that allowed them to target the officers, causing maximum confusion in the ranks. 50 years later, as cochineal production expanded and British power increased, almost all redcoat uniforms were made with cochineal, and there's good evidence that that is what the British Army would have liked all along. The difficulty for them came in obtaining the supply, because for centuries the supply of cochineal was controlled by Spain, with whom the British had a very rocky relationship. Britain was not the only country troubled by Spain's control of the Mexican dye. This is a map of the world in about 1700 showing various empires, and it's the bright lime green area you can see through the North America, the southern part of North America, through Mesoamerica into South America, and a little bit on Spain itself and Europe. That's the only part of the world that has easy access to cochineal. Everybody else has to buy it from them. And there are a lot of buyers. It's popular in Europe. There's demand in Persia, India, the Philippines, even Central Asia. So many of these other empires here are customers. And that meant that there was a big supply problem. Again, lots of demand, tiny supply. What makes things even worse as far as the others are concerned is that Spain is controlling the cochineal so tightly that they don't even know what the substance is. To give you an idea of how strict that control was, let me explain what was involved in traveling to Spanish America during the colonial period. First, you had to have a passport, and as a foreigner, you had no automatic right to one. Even if you managed to get one as a foreigner, you would be turned away if you tried to visit the cochineal producing regions. You might get all the way there, but you wouldn't be allowed in those parts of Oaxaca that grew it. And you'd be kept away from important parts of the trade. If you somehow managed to get past that barrier, and you managed to get a hold of cochineal, then tried to smuggle it out, there were many different guards and soldiers along the way you'd have to pass through. If you were caught with that, you wouldn't just get a little bit of time in prison or something like that. The punishment for this was death. There are 3 substances in the trade of Spanish America that can really get you into trouble if you're caught with them. And one is if you're caught trying to smuggle gold, one is silver, and one is cochineal, which gives you an idea of how important trade was. So with laws like these on the books, it's very hard to get information about cochineal's true nature. And without good information, speculation runs wild. And you have some people thinking that cochineal is a worm or a fly or some kind of animal. Others think that it's a berry or fruit that grows on a bush. And this comes from a manuscript that comes from about 1600 that said cochineal came from a fruit the size of a walnut, and that's cut like corn and afterward beaten to get the seed. And that was accepted in France as the absolute truth. In addition, you had people who kind of tried to hedge their bets, and they would say that it was a worm that turned into a berry back into a worm, a creature they called a worm berry. Not surprising at a time when people believed in spontaneous generation, but very confusing at the time. The best minds in Europe are arguing about this for over 2 centuries, and whole new branches of science had to be developed before they could get an answer. One of the most important players in that controversy is Antony van Leeuwenhoek, the microscope genius of the 17th century. He took up microscopes as a hobby, but what a hobbyist he was. He built microscopes that were a century ahead of their time, far better than anyone else has. And with those, he's able to see cochineal up close. This is what he sees. These are the engravings he publishes in 1704, and he announces to the world that cochineal is an insect. But his microscopes are so good that other people can't get those results, and some refuse to believe this. And it didn't help that Leeuwenhoek had favored the berry theory at one point. He had said it looked like a dried black currant. So it took some time and improvement in microscopes before Leeuwenhoek is finally proved right. And in the meantime, Europeans are searching for a substance and they don't even know what it looks like. They're giving instructions to their colonists to go look for this berry. So they really are having a terrible time trying to get their own sources of cochineal. Throughout those long years of exploration and scientific debate, cochineal is continuing its stylish conquest of the world. As far as most Europeans were concerned, it produced a perfect scarlet. Its dye was much in demand. It doesn't slacken during that time. For those with money to burn, it was possible to completely cover yourself in cochineal silk, which could be found in some of the most gorgeous fashions of the day. And it's part of what helps red maintain its status. It's a color of great prestige, as you can see from this 18th century mantua, now at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Red also wasn't only for women. There's this fabulous silk suit from the 1770s now at the Met in New York. So it was for elite, prestigious fashion. Cochineal is also finding its way to artist palettes. In this painting, for example, Rembrandt is using a pigment made from the dye to heighten the red in the young woman's skirt. Other artists who are painting with cochineal, you have Vermeer, Rubens, Latour, Gainsborough, Turner, many artists, and we're finding more and more as more chemical analysis is done. Most often, what they are using is something called a cochineal lake, which many of you may be familiar with. The idea of a lake, the dye is combined with compounds such as alum to make a pigment. Many painters even make the lake themselves, often from cochineal, but sometimes they would use squeezing from cochineal dye cloth. They would be trying to get just cochineal in any way that they could, and that might be the only thing they could afford. Their results didn't always last. Lakes do have a tendency to fade with exposure to light, especially if the quality is poor, and if you're trying to squeeze your cochineal from a bit of woolen cape, then it's going to be poor. Rembrandt's lake in this painting has lasted for centuries. It is very high quality. In other works of art, and Turner's sunsets are probably the most famous example, the cochineal reds are fading almost from the moment they're set on paper. During this time, we have apothecaries and physicians also using cochineal. Cooks are using it to make desserts and glamorous liqueurs. But above all, it's used as a textile dye. And it continues to be an object of envy and desire. And that means that as the countries start to understand what this substance actually is and they can hone in on it, they are making better and better plans about how to get their own supply. France, Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, eventually the new United States, they're all in on this chase. They are putting out their own spies to try and get hold of this. Of all the spies, my very favorite is a man named Nicolas Joseph Thierry de Menonville, a Frenchman born in 1739 to a family of lawyers. They wanted him to be a lawyer too, but he ran off to Paris to become a botanist. After training with top scientists, he decides the life of an armchair academic is not for him. He wants to win glory for France, and he chooses to do it by going after cochineal. He figures that's the best service he can render to his country. He kept a journal of his adventures in Mexico, and it reads like a sensational novel by Dumas. And this is hand-colored illustrations showing cochineal and its favorite food, the nopal. He came very close to success. He actually is the first person we know of who managed to smuggle it out of Mexico. He brought it to Haiti, and that's where everything fell apart. He did not have the kind of endless patience and knowledge and attention to detail that allowed it to flourish, and it dies. And he himself dies not long afterward. In the end, the people who broke the Spanish monopoly were the Dutch. And it happens really because of something else much bigger, which are the revolutions and the end of empire in South America, as Mexico and Guatemala begin to break away. Then that supply begins to fragment. Spain starts bringing cochineal back closer to home, and the Dutch are able to steal it from Spain. It's suddenly much closer to them. They bring it to Java, and they do have the patience and the knowledge to make it flourish. And soon there's cochineal in many different colonies. This is the middle 19th century. And there are millions and millions and millions of pounds of this stuff being produced, and demand is still holding pretty high. But then there's another development, and that is the invention of artificial dyes. This dress from the late 1860s shows the kinds of colors that early artificial dyes could produce. They were intense, they were really beautiful. Many of them were shades of purple. It took a while longer to produce a good artificial red, and even then it was not quite the equal of cochineal. It was not quite as rich, it didn't have the same sheen, it didn't stand up to light and water as well as cochineal did. But by the 1880s, new red dyes are coming thick and fast, and they take over in no small part because they're getting better, but they're cheaper. They're easier to use. You don't have to be an expert to be able to use these dyes. And the world market for cochineal crashes. The major cochineal producing regions are suddenly descending into a deep and really devastating depression. And the age-old techniques of cochineal dyeing begin to be lost, and that's true even in Mexico itself. The chemical revolution has some other effects. By the early 20th century, color has become cheap. Red is no longer the color of kings. It's the color of the pinup girl, the gun moll, as we see here, the scarlet woman. It had a dangerous and treacherous reputation, and many respectable people stay away from it. Things have loosened up then, and we see red a little differently now, but it's still considered a bold fashion choice, and especially for men. You know, you might wear a red power tie if you're a guy, but you're unlikely to wear a red power suit in the way that 1770s suit stands out to us now. As for cochineal, by the early 1900s, it had lost almost all its market value, and it was in danger of disappearing altogether. It's a cultivated variety. It needs people to provide an environment that is protected for it. And people stopped doing that because it was next to worthless. But in the 1960s and early 70s, some artificial red dyes are linked with cancer, and cochineal's fortunes change again. Because companies are worried about safety and lawsuits, they start looking into natural food colorings like cochineal. And these days, over 1 million pounds of it are produced annually. Most of it's grown in Peru. It's used in hundreds of products, popsicles, candy, fruit juices, sausages, cough syrup, makeup, yogurt. The odds are very good that you've consumed cochineal at some point. It's rarely used for cloth making anymore, but when I was writing my book about this, A Perfect Red, I wanted to get to grips with that part of its history. I'm the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of dyers, but I did not know that much about the craft myself. So I rolled up my sleeves. I learned a lot, and one of my goals was to recreate the color that had dazzled Europe in the 1600s, treble scarlet. As many of you already know, cochineal itself is safe enough to dye with on a kitchen stove. But to make a treble scarlet, you need to work with tin, and tin is not safe to use. in your home, it can create a vapor that will cause health problems. And if you have any of it that gets left on a counter, it's bad news. Fortunately, my father is a scientist and he offered me space in a chemistry lab that had a good hood to ventilate the fumes. In the lab, I heated distilled water in my dye pot. I was looking at a number of different early recipes. Some of this was very secret at the time, so I was making my best guesses in a number of cases about what to use. Um, I weighed the cochineal and ground it to a fine powder with a pestle and mortar, as you see here. I measured out tin and cream of tartar, which is a weak acid that was often used to make treble scarlets. And then everything goes into the pot. I added my scoured silk and I gently stirred it. And about 20 minutes later, I ladled the fabric out of the pot. And the silk just glowed in the light. It was a brilliant red. It was far brighter than anything I had expected. You read these accounts that say dazzling, and dazzling was exactly what it was. I spent the afternoon dyeing the remaining silk. You can see some of the early swatches here. In the very last batches, after most of the cochineal mordants had been used up, the color became noticeably paler. And I got some lovely and intense shades of salmon pink. While I was working with it, there were so many sensory impressions. The fumes of the seething dye pot, the sleekness of that wet silk against my skin, and the dust of cochineal. It's very rough against your fingertips. And all these sights and sounds for me were a way of connecting to a past where red was rare and precious and took a great deal of time and skill to make. They also connected me to the work that's done by modern day artists, farmers, and dyers who are keeping the art of cochineal alive. While researching this book, I went to Oaxaca to see some of them. I visited a modern day nopalry called Tlapanochestli with my friend, the photographer Eric Mindling, where we saw the seeding of cochineal. This is a process that's been done for centuries, perhaps millennia, using little woven baskets that contain the mother insects and their young. Once the baskets are attached to the nopal, the young cochineal can spread out over the cactus, which is exactly what they do. It's how you, if you are running a farm, it's how you're propagating both the nopal and the cochineal with it. In the small town of Teotitlan de Valle, Eric and I visited with Fidel Cruz and his wife, Maria Luisa Mendoza. They're a family of master dyers and weavers who work with cochineal and other natural substances. And as we come to the end of this lecture, I'm going to share some last slides from that visit with you that were taken by Eric. Here, Maria Luisa is grinding cochineal on her metate. And you can see she's working so quickly that it's blurred, and it'll be a really fine powder by the time she is done. Fidel Cruz and the undyed wool, as it's about to go into the dye pot, you can see the steam rising. It's quite hot. It's not boiling, it's a bit below that. And here's early stages. What you're doing as you're dyeing is you're putting it in, you're taking it out. It takes a lot of time. It's partly a science, it's an early science when you read these old manuscripts, but it's also an art. It comes from a time when science and art were not so divided. And here you see late stages where we're starting to get really vivid color. And it comes down to just the judgment of when you take it out, you understand that in some cases, dyes may intensify, and others, they'll take a step down. This is where that experience really helps you create the color that you want, but it's always going to be a little different. That's just in the nature of natural dyes. And here we have the wool dyeing on the line. You can see some of the darker wools that were in all the way on the left. The sunlight on the wool, bringing out all the different shades from scarlets down to crimsons. I'm going to end my talk with this image of a tapete woven by Fidel Cruz. Every color in it comes from a natural dye, every single color. And the reds are made with cochineal. I think it conveys so well the astonishing and intense beauty of cochineal, as well as the way that the dye continues to be deeply rooted in the land and culture of Mexico and Latin America. So thank you so much for listening to this. I'll be very happy to answer questions. I know Eva is going to help run that. Again, thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Amy. That was a very beautiful presentation. So let's see. Well, I have a quick question to ask with your practical experience. Those fabrics that you dyed with the tin, did you experience any fading, like, or any, just how's it been?
I have been quite careful about light. I will say I've done some things where I tested them and I did not get a lot of, with the intense shades, I did not get a lot of that, but I just want you to see what can happen from a single batch if you just keep dyeing and dyeing and dyeing, because it will use things up. So you might get, at the early stages, you might get something like this, a really intense scarlet. Beautiful. This is the kind of shade I'm talking about, where I said I was like, wow, they really did mean dazzling. They really meant, no wonder they were like, it was on fire. And you can imagine what that might look like. You can see it's catching the light under candlelight. That would still be red under candlelight. It must have been a sensation. It was a sensation. Toward the end, you're starting to get paler colors and paler colors till you're getting sort of more salmony colors. If you work, I don't know how well this will show on here, but with alum, you're going to get more crimson colors from this. So look at those shades. They're using the same cochineal. I'm using it from the same batch. There's nothing different about the cochineal, but the mordant is different. And you're getting something entirely.
Oh, Amy, I'm sorry. I think we lost you.
There, is that better? I saw it suddenly.
Yeah, you're okay.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Did you miss all of that, or did you get much?
No, we got it all, just that last 2 seconds.
Okay, yes. Well, you saw the difference in the mordants. Mordants are really important. And it was very important for me. I would never classify myself as an expert dyer. That would take years and years to do. But spending a lot of time working with these myself before I was writing about them was really important to my understanding of how they work and the history behind them.
That's right. Yeah, it's the making and the research, they opens more questions and more connections that you have with the material and the color, and it comes alive more and more, for sure. So let me just see, it looks like we have some questions here. So I want to acknowledge Alicia asks, let's see, your love of red or cochineal inspired you to study and research any other colors?
I'm always keeping my eye out for color research. I would say I certainly have looked into some. There are some other people who have specialized. I also love blues. People often ask, is that the only color? I just love color. I always have. My earliest memories are of fabrics and colors, and that's what my eye is drawn toward. What I would say it's done is really meant that everywhere I go, I look at color differently. I look at, even just the sky differently, thinking about early words for color. There's a word, glaucus, that means blue and yellow together, and it doesn't make any sense to our modern mind. The Greeks had this word. If you look at the skies, the pale sunlight is coming through, very fine clouds. Of course, it makes sense. That's what we see. And so I think about these words as I go about my everyday life. And certainly if I'm in a museum and I'm just looking at paintings, I think about them differently because of writing this book. And that's not just the reds, but all the colors. You see them as they're part of a human history and part of a natural history.
Yeah, most definitely. I can see that correlation, that circle. So the next we have Hillary McDonald. She asks, was cochineal traded to the indigenous people to the north? So I'm wondering if she means North America.
If it does, I mean, it was traded quite far north. You had many traders in Canada who would have been carrying this. It goes throughout the Americas, from the very southern parts of South America up through the um, just quite far north in Canada, as far as I know, because that fir tree does go very far north, and those red blankets are, you know, so many cultures. I can't say every culture, but um, just countless cultures really value red. That thing about the so many languages, that first word beyond black and white is red. There just is something in the human mind that is drawn to red, probably again because it's blood. It connects with birth and death and sex and violence and all of these things that, you know, we pay attention to. So the fact that Europe had found this technology using American materials to make this very bright red that's then gets up to the wilds of Canada, it's valued. So you see it popping up all over. It's traded, as I said, you start finding cochineal out in the steppes of Asia Minor and making its way out toward Mongolia. I mean, this stuff gets everywhere. People want it.
Wow, oh, that's amazing. Okay, then we have Zoriana asks, she says, thank you for your wonderful talk. Do you know if the artists use cochineal to paint unimportant objects in paintings like a glass of red wine?
They may have done. It depended on how much money you had and how available cochineal was where you were. There's a point with Dutch paintings where they all go kind of gray and brown, and it's because they're having a war and pigments are hard to get. If you look at Venice, they have wonderful, colorful paintings. You have masters of color like Titian working there, and that's the center for the dye trade. And so it's a little easier to get dyes there. So a lot of these questions about who is painting with what probably had to do with what the local supply was like. We're still getting to grips with what was used where, because to be sure of that, you actually have to scrape a little bit and you'll get just a tiny fraction, but still you're taking some paint away from the painting and subjecting it to chemical analysis. And more of that work is being done, but there's always a cost. So it's not going to be done to everything.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Okay, Catalina asks, do you know if the British Army still uses cochineal for their military uniforms?
They do not, but they did use it for a long, long time. But like everybody else, when these other dyes come in, eventually they make the switch. They're cheaper, but also it isn't just that the dye is cheaper, it's that it's cheaper to use because you don't need the same level of expertise. Now, if we started saying, what's the environmental cost of some of these dyes, maybe we'd make a different calculus, but we haven't done that even now, let alone, what we were doing 100 years ago.
Right, yeah. Ramona asks, can you speak a little bit about cardinal red?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. We talk about cardinal red, and there's also a term cardinal purple, and they're actually talking about the same thing. Cardinal purple for a very long time was what the color that the cardinals wore, and it was actually a purple. It came from a snail that came from the Mediterranean, and it was over in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the supply becomes more and more constricted. So it's around Constantinople that they have the knowledge of how to use that snail and how to get the color. And it is a complicated process, as so many expensive, beautiful dyes are. But Constantinople falls in the middle of the 1400s, and I think it's 1453. And a lot of things are lost then. And one of the things that's lost is the knowledge of how to make this beautiful silk that's worn by the cardinals. And so they have to find something else. And again, what I was talking about before, that people didn't just think about the hue, they thought about other qualities of a color. And one of the things about cardinal purple was it was expensive and it was luminous, and it just gave you such a sense of the intensity of that color. The closest thing to that was Kermes. And again, if I had showed you using alum that you get sort of purplish colors from cochineal, you also got them from the Kermes that were there before. And so cardinal purple starts getting redder and redder because that's what they're using. And eventually, I think they too would have used cochineal. By about 1580, cochineal had just taken most of the European market. It was just so beautiful. So sometimes we say cardinal red now, but if you read about cardinal purple, if it's from about 1500, it's actually a red. If it's from 1400, it's probably a purple.
Oh, wow. That's great. Oh, I love it. Okay. So Ruth asks, she says, thank you for a fascinating talk. You mentioned an area in the UK where military uniforms were dyed red. I wonder where it was.
It's in Gloucestershire, which is not far from where I am. I'm in Oxfordshire. I have ancestors from Gloucestershire. And that was a center for this kind of woolen trade. We have lots of sheep here even today, and back then there were even more sheep. And what England wanted to get into was not just providing the raw material of really good wool. It wanted to get the top dollar for that. And the way to do that was to manufacture things to take it several steps further on in the process. We still have these discussions as countries today of like, you want to use technology. At the time, the best technology, the high-tech industries were cloth. And so they were trying to move from raw materials of wool to producing the best, most beautiful red cloth. And so they were doing that in Gloucestershire, very close to where the wool was being taken off the sheep and carded and gotten ready so that it could take dye.
Oh, okay. Okay. So Fran asks, does Peru have a long history of cochineal production, or is that more recent? I know that there's a question between Oaxaca and Peru, if it really does.
Yes. Many countries in Latin America claim cochineal. We have a good sense that actually it's where the origin of the domesticated form. So the really the one that was a world commodity, that is Oaxaca. And we know about that partly from just looking at how it was used and how integral it was to the culture, looking back, back 500 to 1,000 years ago and more. But also because it's a pretty good rule of thumb when you're looking at a species that the area where it has the most predators is probably where it developed, because the predators develop along with it. And if you go to the southern Mexican highlands, that's definitely where cochineal has the most predators. And there's just a very long history of that there. So it's, while there are national reasons to claim cochineal, the domesticated form of this insect really does seem to be Oaxaca. Now, there is all this wild cochineal, and it's in many places, and it does get used. And we have ancient burials in Peru that are with textiles that are made with cochineal, and that seems to have been from these wild varieties. So I in no way want to imply that there isn't a very deep and long connection with cochineal and other regions of Latin America. But the part of the reason why Peru has become a mainstay of that is precisely because there are somewhat fewer predators there, which makes it easier to grow. But it also comes down to what other things can you produce? What is the cost of labor? What kind of workforce do you have? Do you have a very rural country? Do you have other choices of things that you can make? Cochineal is, it's still a quite expensive commodity. You can get a good return on it. The problem with it is partly that, it's so labor intensive, but also that it's very volatile. It, as I mentioned before, it's a temperamental little beast. And so if you get a frost at the wrong time, or the temperature is too high, which in these days of climate change is just happening a lot, then it can just really devastate the yields. And so you see that the price of cochineal goes up and down, because the supply is going up and down, up and down. Sometimes also demand changes, but a lot of it's still just the supply.
Right, right. Okay. Valerie asks, yes, please address Cardinal's robe.
Ah, yes. Well, I think I've done that fairly thoroughly, but it is wonderful to me just to see how tied in these colors become with, with the church, with majesty, and they become almost like this ring of meanings, that a color is prestigious because it's rare. It's maybe partly that, again, just that our brain chemistry is such that we're really drawn to this color. But then also, as cultures take on different colors, they acquire other meanings. And so they then, that reinforces those meanings too. So yeah, it's a really quite tight interweaving. As a writer, when you're writing about it, you can often find, you have to be careful you're not on a constant Ferris wheel of things, and you have to find a place to enter that wheel and a place to get off it.
Okay. Judith, do you know which role cochineal had traditionally in Mexico? Was it a color for everybody, or one of high status as well?
I think we know a little less about that, and most likely it was high status, because again, it was not, it was more abundant than, say, would have been per person in Europe later on. But the fact that the Aztecs were collecting it as tribute suggests to us that it was, again, a very valuable substance. And so most likely it was still, a lot of it would have been used as elite good. However, you don't need just, tons of the stuff. You can use a very tiny little bit and it will really make an impact. And we do have some sense that it was used at times to color walls. And so there's some sense that it could be used in wider applications. But unfortunately, we know less, in part because, so much evidence disappeared. And a lot of what we know about that time comes from what was written down by the Spanish conquistadors, particularly the friars, some of whom were interested, sometimes for reasons of their own, in getting down what the indigenous culture of the place was like before it was lost forever.
Okay. Okay. So Una writes, wonderful information and images. How about getting red from sea, is it I think she's saying molluscus in Northern Europe?
There are different, I know that it can be obtained from lichen. I haven't heard about mollusks, but I wouldn't rule it out that there are the mollusks that are used in making those cardinal purples, the ones that are connected with Constantinople. But in Mexico, again, if you go to Oaxaca, if you go out near the sea, and there are also snails like these murex snails in the Mediterranean that also make a purple. And there are still some people who have preserved that art and how to deal with it. So I would love to know more if you want to send me information.
Okay, wonderful. We will pass that on for sure. Okay, Lawrence asks, is cochineal visible with Raman spectroscopy as an alternative to scraping paint off masterpieces?
I'm not an expert in the analysis, and it has evolved somewhat over time how they are choosing to do these. But what I have been told is that there's depending on the era, there are techniques that don't involve the scraping and that can use the spectroscopy, but it's still necessary in some cases to go ahead and use a bit of the scraping. And often they're looking for other information too. It's partly about, what the composition is. If you really want to understand what is in that paint, then you're probably going to need the finer grade chemical analysis. But again, as I said, that's not my primary area of expertise. And I do know the field has been evolving a great deal over the past 20 years. And, of course, we want to find ways to learn as much information as we can without destroying things. But, there are times where, it's really minute amounts now that they can tell a lot from.
Okay.
Can I interject something?
Please.
One of the problems with cochineal is it is not a mineral. So its chemical makeup is very different from, say, red iron oxide. And you can only use certain types of analysis or spectroscopy to identify organic materials like cochineal. It's would be the same for any lake pigment or any botanical that's being used. So, and I don't know exactly what spectroscopy they are using for that, but it's definitely a different process because of it's a completely different chemical makeup.
And you have also the agents that are in it. One of the things that's quite difficult to do is telling the difference, say, between kermes and cochineal. You can do that with chemical analysis. They are different dyes underneath, but they're really complex organic chemicals. The reason that this red is made for the insect is it's a defense mechanism. It's to keep things from eating it. It's very bitter. And probably the red is also a bit of a warning color as well, as it so often is in nature. But it's a very bitter, very complex organic chemical.
Okay. This is a nice, fun question. A little twist is from Bree. She's asked, can I ask about your research process? Your knowledge is so vast. I imagine it would be easy to get lost when reading. And do you have your favorite primary or secondary source?
Oh, there are too many. I get lost too, in the sense that I love the primary research. I love what I do. To me, it's so important to have a multitude of voices. When I'm looking at these dye books, I love looking at the recipe books. You have to remember all the time, a lot wasn't written down. These were trade secrets, and they initially began as trade secrets of people who do not read or write. But nevertheless are extremely skilled at what they do. They are making masterpieces. And so as this does begin to be set down in writing, you have to remember that it's like the iceberg, where there's a huge amount of knowledge and centuries and time that brings that out. So I guess, for me, it's always a matter of reading as widely as I can, especially for something like this, because it does touch on so many places. And I know that for some people that would probably be just either aggravating or demoralizing, but I find it very exciting.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much. That's it for the comments and questions in the chat. Is there anybody that would like to speak up and ask? We probably have, Melly, how much more time do we have? Oh, I can't hear you.
We've got a few more minutes. If
few more
you
minutes.
want to throw your hands up.
Yeah, and then just unmute and ask Amy. Let's see. Anyone?
No more questions?
No more? Well, should nobody else have anything else to ask, I just want to say thank you so much. And everybody, those were brilliant questions. just really quite extend even further into your presentation, Amy. Melanie, would you like to add anything else?
Well, I really want to thank you, Amy. This was an incredible talk. And I think that cochineal is such an interesting material because it can be used in so many different ways. And I mean, history has shown that there is a huge demand. And even today, while I was doing some research looking for, different information on cochineal to include in our library, I was actually a little surprised at how much is still used today.
Mhm.
That there's probably just as much use today as there was 500 years ago. So I don't know if it's used in the dye industry quite as much, but it's certainly used in the food and cosmetic industries. So, but thank you, Amy. I really appreciate you doing this. And I want to thank everybody for coming today. It's always good to see all the regular faces, and it's good to see all the new people too. So thank you all. And thanks,
Thank
Eva Maria, for being our host today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for those great questions. It really was a pleasure to talk with you, to talk with people who have such an interest in color.
Well, that's definitely